Boa tarde a todos e todas que estão acompanhando pelos canais da Escola Superior de Advocacia do Estado do Espírito Santo essa nossa primeira oportunidade para realizarmos um evento de cunho internacional aqui para a nossa Escola Superior de Advocacia. Receberemos hoje, com muita honra, o professor David Landau, professor da Florida State University, onde leciona, dentre outras disciplinas, a cadeira de Direito Constitucional, autor renomado, recentemente citado em nosso Supremo Tribunal Federal, com a sua pesquisa sobre constitucionalismo abusivo, num voto do ministro Luiz Roberto Barroso. Com essa perspectiva, diante da relevância da sua doutrina crescendo aqui no Brasil para os nossos estudos constitucionais, nós fizemos o convite através do Dr. Rafael Coelho, que foi aluno do professor Landau na Flórida. O professor Landau gentilmente aceitou o convite e está conosco aqui. Agradeço penhoradamente ao Dr. Alexandre Zampronho, presidente da nossa Escola Superior de Advocacia, que estaria conosco, mas acaba de ter um problema de saúde. Foi ao médico porque travou as costas. Agradeço também o presidente da Comissão de Estudos Constitucionais, Dr. João Dalcol, que está conosco hoje, e especialmente agradeço ao professor David Landau. Thank you, Professor Landau. Nossa apresentação será feita em inglês a partir desse ponto, e posteriormente a Escola Superior de Advocacia buscará apresentar legendas para inclusão na TV OAB. From this point on, I would like to start and pass the word to Rafael Coelho, who is going to lead this meeting today. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you, Professor Locke. Well, I'm going to repeat a little what Professor Locke just said. I would first like to thank Professor David Landau that kindly accepted my invitation to share some constitutional knowledge. Professor Landau has a PhD degree from Harvard. He's a Mason-led professor at Florida State University College of Law, teaching constitutional law, and served as Associate Dean for International Programs in charge of the Graduate LLM program. For those who might be interested in pursuing an international degree, this is the guy you want to be talking to. I would like to thank Professor Locke, an attorney non-state and national-wide already. Disregard for presentations, everyone knows him. And Dr. João, president of the Constitutional Studies section of the Espírito Santo bar, the OAB do Espírito Santo. We have a live chat through Zoom and YouTube where you can send us questions to Professor Landau and Professor Locke that will be answered by the end of the webinar. I only ask you to state your name, place, and to whom you're addressing your question. Subtitles will be added afterwards, and the video will be available on this YouTube channel, the ESA TV Espírito Santo, if I'm not mistaken. If your question was not selected, you may send it to me through my personal Instagram account, Rafael B. Coelho, and I will kindly forward it to the speakers. Now I'll just do like brief introduction before I pass on to Professor Locke again. To Professor Landau. Professor Landau, it's no news that we are currently experiencing here in Brazil a very active judicial branch and Supreme Court, often using controversial decisions. This week, some of the justices said that the institution may take defensive actions despite the Constitution. So it's a rather controversial statement, and we want to know if this is a form of abusive constitutionalism, and later on, Dr. Locke could talk about the Supreme Court limits here in Brazil and what are the remedies for abusive constitutionalism from the Supreme Court. So you may start whenever you want. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks so much for the invitation. Professor Aloccio, I had the opportunity, the pleasure of meeting in Tallahassee before the pandemic, shortly before the pandemic. And then Raphael was a terrific student of mine this past year in the LLM program at Florida State University, studying American law. So a student of mine, I think, both in civil procedure and constitutional law. So two very different subjects. But it was wonderful to have you in both classes. And if anyone has any interest in our LLM program or wants to discuss just the prospect of studying in the U.S. with me, I'm happy to do that. I'm sure Raphael can share my email or whatever else you need to get in touch with me. So the topic, and I do think it's timely to some degree in Brazil, also in the United States, frankly, and in many other parts around the world, is this this project I'll sketch called Abusive Constitutionalism, which started as an article I wrote now about 5 or 6 years ago, but has the research agenda has kind of grown over time. So I've done a bunch of kind of follow-up projects on it, and actually completing a book on sort of the an offshoot of this as well. It's going to get published by Oxford University Press, hopefully next year, if we can deliver it on time. What I'm going to talk about today it's really kind of the seminal project, Abusive Constitutionalism itself, the first article. And then I will talk a little bit about this project that we did as a follow-up called Abusive Judicial Review that I co-authored with Roz Dixon, that looks at courts as carrying out projects of abusive constitutionalism. And so I'll kind of talk about both of those projects, and I'll try to talk, for probably about 30 minutes. So to start, what's the motivation for the project? The idea was, and this is an observation that now I think has become commonplace, right? There's a lot of studies that suggest this, that the way that democracy erodes has changed to some degree in the world. Things that used to be quite common, like the military coup, have become much less common in many regions of the world. You think about Latin America as an example, right? I mean, at one point, military coups were quite common in the region. Now they're not. And so democracy doesn't tend to kind of implode suddenly through a kind of clear rupture of the democratic order. Instead, you see projects of erosion that undermine democracy largely by using legal tools and constitutional tools. So the paradox, in a sense, the central paradox is you're using the tools of the Constitution itself to undermine the Constitution, in a sense, right? To actually kind of go against it. And that, in a way, I guess a central problem is it's very hard to design democratic institutions such that they're not vulnerable to that risk. It's not an easy thing to do. And many of the solutions that have been developed, a lot of which came out of post-World War II Germany, for example, aren't really applicable to the modern kinds of movements, I think, that undermine democracy. So what is abusive constitutionalism in a sense? I guess we would define it as the use of the tools of, so my initial article, I define it as the use of the formal tools of constitutional change as a way to undermine democracy itself. So in that initial paper, I'm focused on basically two tools: constitutional amendment and constitutional replacement, right? So changing an existing constitution or writing a new constitution as a way to undermine democracy. The definition to us, and this is where I think, abuse is a strong term, right? You say that something is being abused, there is a pejorative that is inevitably going along with that term. And so it was important, I think, to me, and some of the more recent work I've done with Roz Dixon, to both of us, to kind of get that right, and to make sure that you're not just calling abusive anything you don't like, right? So you're not happy with a decision, you shouldn't, just call it abusive as a matter of course. And so to us, it is tied, to democracy, and a relatively minimal conception of democracy at that, right? We try to reach kind of almost a lowest common denominator definition that you see in political science and kind of modern law that focuses on the fairness of elections in some sense, right? So the idea is that you want a relatively level electoral playing field. If you allow incumbents to tilt the electoral playing field too much in their favor, the degree to which your democratic erodes. You might not be kind of old school authoritarian in the sense that your elections are shams, but there's a good chance you're going to be what Levitsky and Way have called competitive authoritarian, which means you still have elections. They're not total shams. There's not like massive ballot stuffing on election day, but the elections are systemically unfair. And I think most commonly when modern democratic regimes erode, they erode in that direction, right? They kind of, they reach towards a competitive authoritarian space in a sense. And that's because what we've learned is there are a lot of ways that are pretty subtle to rig, if you want to use a crude term, elections, right? I mean, the crudest are the count is a fake. And you do see that sometimes, right? But usually you see that from pretty desperate actors when you see it. So Venezuela, Maduro's kind of sham constituent assembly, they just rigged the count, right? So because they were embarrassed that no one showed up even to vote in these elections, so they rigged the count, it looks like. Similarly, Bolivia, there were allegations that Morales in his last election kind of rigged the count on election day. That's crude. It tends to get caught because there are election monitors on the ground watching, right? So it's harder to do that, but there's lots of other ways you can tilt the playing field in your favor. What does the media landscape look like, right? Is the media systemically biased in your favor? Do you repress opposition media outlets? And there's all sorts of ways you can do that, right? Using the law, and lots of different types of law, defamation, antitrust, right? There are lots of ways you can achieve a kind of consolidated media in your favor. Electoral commissions, which control things like financing for parties and registration for parties and candidates. That's a way that you can kind of tilt the playing field well before election day. So it's one of the interesting things that's happened, I think, with kind of the theories of regimes is that we now know there are all these intermediate types between democracy and authoritarianism, even if all you're focusing on is elections, even if you have a minimalist definition of democracy. And that means that constitutionally, the project is very complex. There are lots and lots of different entry points through which democracy is vulnerable to attack. Lots of different institutions that can be a locus of attack. Constitutional courts are an obvious one that we all think about because we're lawyers. But, there are lots of others, media commissions, electoral commissions, ombudspersons. All of these institutions may have a significant role in kind of defending modern electoral democracy. So the definition is minimalist, but that doesn't make it simple, right? Even a minimalist definition requires a fair amount of robustness and protection so that elections actually are on a level playing field, right? So that's kind of the complexity just definitionally with figuring out what is abusive, right? But it is to us tied to democracy. It's not tied to broader concepts like constitutional identity, right? Necessarily. So it's not about how significantly change the Constitution. It's about the direction of change and its impact on democracy. It's not to us directly about liberalism, although of course we are both, me and my co-author are both very invested in liberal democracy, but the project itself is about democracy. That said, I can talk about this a little bit later on, is many changes to the liberal dimension also affect the democratic dimension. So the two tend to erode together most of the time, right? So for example, an illiberal regime takes over a constitutional court. Well, that's going to have lots of illiberal effects. It's going to mean that minorities and minority parties don't have the same type of ability to have their rights protected. But it's also going to probably have an anti-democratic effect, right? Because it's going to allow the incumbents to tilt the playing field heavily in their favor. So the two things, I've been writing about this recently. The liberal and the democratic dimension are theoretically separable. They're different. And you often see actors like Viktor Orban in Hungary said, oh, I'm an illiberal Democrat. So he proudly proclaimed himself an illiberal. But of course, he doesn't want to call himself an authoritarian. And the truth is he's both, right? Because the very same moves that undermine liberalism end up most of the time attacking democracy. Okay, that's a lot on definitions, but I think you kind of need it, right, in a sense to set up the project. So what are kind of examples of the original phenomenon? We go through kind of several. I go through several in the paper, both a result of kind of constitutional amendment and constitutional replacement. But I think you can find plenty of others if you think about it around the world. So I was looking to some degree at Colombia under President Alvaro Uribe between 2002 and 2010. So he was president and a quite successful president. But he was also interested in remaining in power, right? And so Colombia had a strict one-term limit on presidents. Uribe has a policy that is perceived as successful of what he called democratic security, which was to pursue a military solution against guerrilla groups right in the country. He gets some successes, so his popularity is very high. And towards the end of his first term, he says, you know what, I want to amend the Constitution now to allow me a second term. And it's the Colombian Constitution is a flexible constitution. It isn't that hard to amend the Colombian Constitution. It takes 2 rounds of congressional approval, a simple majority in the first round, and an absolute majority in the second round. So Uribe is able to achieve that change and allow allow a second consecutive term. It's challenged in front of the Constitutional Court of Colombia, right? And the Constitutional Court issues a decision in 2005 where it says this is okay, basically, right? So the constitutional amendment is challenged in the court, both on procedural grounds and on substantive grounds. Essentially, the argument is that this is an unconstitutional constitutional amendment because it effectively replaces rather than merely altering core parts of the Constitution. And the court rejects the challenge. Uribe wins a second term, also remains highly popular, right? And then around about the end of his second term says, you know what, I kind of would want a third term, right? I'm not ready to leave yet. I'll take a third term. And they prepare another amendment, which would be done by referendum, which would allow Uribe to serve 3 consecutive terms in office. It goes up to the Constitutional Court of Colombia again, and the Constitutional Court of Colombia this time issues a decision that is a landmark, right? I think both within Colombia and kind of comparatively, where they say this is invalid, both because of the procedure. There were irregularities in the way in the legislative procedure in the Congress, and maybe more interesting for our purpose, on substantive grounds, right? That this is an unconstitutional constitutional amendment because allowing a president to have 3 terms in office distorts the system of government in ways that make it meaningfully less democratic and that make the separation of powers less significant. And they go through an analysis that's quite interesting. Part of what they do is look at other presidential regimes around the world, and they find that it's quite common to allow 2 consecutive terms, but very, very, very rare to allow more than 2. And most of the places around the world that allow more than two, actually that have no term limit at all, a lot of them are problematic, right? They're not places we would hold up as kind of exemplars of democracy. They're rather, places that are seen as being authoritarian or at least problematic democracies. And they also look at the details of the system, right? And they say, well, with 12 years in office, the president would have appointed every institution that effectively is supposed to be checking the president, right? So all of the institutions that are meant to check, the president would have controlled. And then there's a kind of real political analysis that with 12 years in office, as we know, right, in presidential systems, presidents are enormously powerful officials. They consolidate power over time. And with 12 consecutive years in office, they're just going to have an enormous amount of power over the rest of the system. So the court, for all those reasons, blocks the change. And it's really, interesting, the result. I mean, Uribe leaves office, right? Someone from his movement, Juan Manuel Santos, wins the election in 2010. But it's a different actor. Uribe is forced out of power. And that has momentous consequences for Colombian politics, right? Santos ends up being a very different actor, pursues a peace process with the FARC, and Uribe becomes the leader of the opposition, right? In the Senate, returns actually to the Senate to lead the opposition to Santos. So it's an interesting moment at which I think there is a good argument that this protected Colombian democracy from what would have been significant erosion if you had allowed one actor to remain in power for that long. That's the success story. Unfortunately, it's hard to find the success stories, right? In fact, a friend of mine, Mila Versteeg, did a study with some of her co-authors to look at judicial responses to presidents seeking to extend their term limits. And they found that the Colombian example is the only example in the world that they could find of a court blocking a president from basically being able to evade term limits. So they don't find any other examples, which means something exceptional is going on in the Colombian case, right? Something very unusual. And we know, right, the Colombian Constitutional Court has an unusual amount of both kind of independence and power in comparative terms, right? It's a very strong court and a very independent court from the political branches. The other examples I looked at in the paper are not success stories. They're bad examples. So I look at Venezuela early on when Chavez wins the presidency in the late 90s and replaces the constitution. And I look at the dynamic of constitution making in Venezuela, where basically he bypasses the opposition. So he wins the presidency, but he still has to deal with an opposition-controlled Congress and opposition-controlled Supreme Court. So he says to himself, how do I get out of this situation? And what he does is he unilaterally calls a constituent assembly, right? Without the Congress. He unilaterally calls a constituent assembly. He writes the electoral rules for the constituent assembly, and they're ones that were really good for him. So like his forces won about 60 to 65% of the vote in the elections to the Constituent Assembly, but they won about 95% of the seats because of the way the electoral rules were drafted. So the opposition is wiped out at the Constituent Assembly. It's completely controlled by Chavista elements. And they do very interesting things. First of all, they write a constitution, but they write a constitution very, very quickly. Right? They rapidly write the text. But they also do these other things. The Constituent Assembly says, look, we have original constituent power. We're above every other institution because we represent the people. And nobody else represents the people the way we do. So they start shutting down other institutions. They end up closing the Supreme Court, basically shutting down the Congress, removing local officials like mayors, union officials. And so what happens is out of that constitution-making process, Chavez consolidates a lot of power, right? And so you enter that with Chavez checked, and you leave that process with him not really checked. The other example I go through is Hungary, where they start by amending, so basically this movement Fidesz wins about 55% of the vote, but about 68% of the seats, which means that they can unilaterally amend the Constitution. They start amending the Constitution right away. They go after the Constitutional Court. They reduce its powers, etc. Then they just replace it entirely. And the new Constitution is one that consolidates a lot of power in Fidesz. So it gives them a lot more control over the various institutions that are meant to check them. So again, constitution making becomes a very powerful tool by which this movement consolidates power. So I think this is pretty common. I think there are lots of other examples around the world that you can point to of this phenomenon. Here in Latin America, Ecuador, for example, was an example. I think Bolivia, to some degree, was an example. Elsewhere in the world, you can look at places like Turkey, right? There is this really interesting question of what you do about it, right? So like, how do you, it's a problem, but like, what is the solution? And I sort of canvass a bunch of stuff. Nothing is that attractive, right? I think for a number of reasons. I mean, you can think about, so first of all, you can think about the design of the constitutional text. So can you create amendment rules that deal effectively with the problem? And it turns out, I think it's pretty hard to do. There are two things you can do that are quite common in Latin America, right? And you have elements of them here in Brazil in the Constitution. One is to what I've called sort of tier the constitutional rule so that some things are harder to do than others. Like ideally, getting rid of term limits would be harder than changing the details of the system of financing for local governments, right? Both things might require an amendment, but like getting rid of a term limit, we know is going to be dangerous. And so you make that harder to do. You require additional procedures, a higher supermajority, a referendum. Here's an interesting fact. The Ecuadorian, Venezuelan, and Bolivian constitutions all have a tiered design. All three. In all three cases, Presidents Chavez, Morales, and Correa sought to get rid of their term limits or extend them. All of those cases were challenged in front of the constitutional courts, and the argument was exactly that, this is on the higher tier. This is hard. You need a more demanding procedure to do this. And in all three cases, the constitutional courts gave the same answer. Nah, you can do this using the easy procedure. The easy procedure is fine. This is not a worry at all about democracy. In fact, they all developed this argument that like, this is pro-democratic, right? It's pro-democratic because it helps voters exercise their rights. It takes away the limit that voters had on voting for whoever they wanted, right? And so, truthfully, like that design solution is only so good as the courts that are actually working with the design solution. And it turns out, of course, those courts are packed by the incumbents, so you wouldn't expect them to have any independence, and they don't. You also have what happened in Colombia, the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, which has this, I think, really positive result in Colombia of stopping an abusive form of constitutional change. But as I mentioned before, this is the only example that people can find of this. Alas, in Latin America, there are lots of examples of the opposite phenomenon, which is courts ripping term limits out of constitutions at the behest of powerful incumbents, right? So Ortega in Nicaragua lacked the votes to amend the constitution, but he wanted to run for re-election. What does he do? He goes to the Supreme Court and he tells the Supreme Court, hey, look at this term limit. This thing is unconstitutional, right? And the term limit had been added to the Nicaraguan constitution as an amendment. And the court makes the same argument. Yeah, this is bad, right? This term limit conflicts with core precepts of the Constitution because it limits the rights of voters. So it rips the term limit out of the Nicaraguan Constitution, and Ortega has been in power ever since, right? Honduras and Bolivia, very similar decisions. The Bolivian one is the most shocking because of the context, right? First of all, Morales loses a referendum to extend term limits. So the people say, no, thank you, right? We don't want you to stay in power forever. He then formulates this plan, I'll go to the Constitutional Court and let them do it. And his allies control the Constitutional Court. And they issue a decision getting rid of the term limit, which is particularly peculiar. And I have an article on this because it was not an amendment. It was part of the original 2009 Constitution. So they used the Constitution to get rid of the Constitution, if that makes any sense. Not an amendment to the Constitution, but the original Constitution. And the argument is that we can do this because this is a violation of like inter-American human rights law. So a term limit is a violation of inter-American human rights law. That's nuts. I mean, to speak colloquially, that is insane, right? But that's what the court does. After that, the OAS, the Organization of American States, interestingly, asked the Venice Commission in Europe to issue an advisory opinion, a report on whether there was any support for this view. And the Venice Commission said no. There's not any support for the idea that a term limit is a violation of human rights, right? But that didn't stop the Bolivian court from doing what it's doing. My point, I guess, being that the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, too, is only as good as the institution applying it, right? So it's, if you have the Colombian Constitutional Court in an extraordinary context, they can issue this decision telling Uribe you can't run again. But in most realistic contexts where you're worried about democratic erosion, it's not clear that the court is going to have the capacity to issue that kind of decision. And in fact, they may do the opposite, which is that they actually aid the regime in doing anti-democratic stuff, right? So domestic design solutions are not easy to find, ones that will work well, realistically. You can also think about kind of the international level. For example, the OAS has a clause that was famously used during the coup in 2009 that removes Zelaya from power in Honduras, which is a kind of, referred to as kind of an anti-coup clause. But it basically allows for sanctions if there are unconstitutional interruptions of the democratic order. The problem with the international level is, these institutions can be improved, but right now they're kind of designed mainly to go after coups. So they're designed for like the old problem and not the new one. Even in Honduras, like Zelaya was indeed removed by a coup, but Zelaya himself was kind of a threat to the democratic order, right? He was actually trying to call a constituent assembly at that time so that he could make an end run around the Honduran term limit, right? Which would have kicked him out of power. So the idea is he was probably trying to call a constituent assembly so he could remain in power. The international system doesn't do as well with that kind of subtler threat to democracy, the abusive constitutionalism threat I'm talking about. It's just not really set up to identify or deal with those kinds of threats, I think, at this point. So that's pessimistic, right? But that's kind of where I would say we are with respect to defenses. It's not easy. Now, the last thing I would say is, this goes back to the point I made when I was talking about the term limits. Courts themselves are often part of the problem, right? So this is the recent piece we wrote called Abusive Judicial Review, that courts often become part of a regime strategy to undermine democracy. Regimes turn to courts to do things that are anti-democratic, and courts sometimes oblige and do them. And it's kind of interesting, like, why does this happen? Well, we think a lot of it is that courts have a legitimacy, actually, internationally, that other actors don't. So if a court does something, it looks legal, even if it is, in fact, totally nuts, right? Like, it kind of gets a veneer of legality and constitutionality. And so regimes and anti-democratic actors will capture a court or pack a court and then use that court to do a bunch of stuff on behalf of the regime. And there are some great examples of this around the world. I don't want to go into it in too much depth, but the idea is, that there's kind of two forms of this. One is like the classic rubber stamp form, where courts, whatever you propose, courts say, thumbs up, right? It's fine. And so this happens a lot. Like, a great example of this is Poland. The Polish regime, the PIS party, has lacked the votes to amend the constitution. So they came up with a great alternative strategy: pack the court and then pass a bunch of laws that are flagrantly unconstitutional. But once you pack the court's going to say they're fine, right? So, like, if you control the court, you control the meaning of the Constitution in some ways. And so that's what they did in Poland. The stronger form, which is more interesting to us, is where the court carries out tasks for the regime. And actually, I've already given you some examples, right? The term limits ones in Latin America are great examples of this. And there's some African examples as well. You don't have the votes to amend the Constitution to get rid of the term limit. Or, like Morales, you're afraid you're going to lose a referendum, right? Because your proposal is not actually that popular. What is your workaround? Go to a court and let the court do it, right? So the court magically gets rid of the term limit, and then you don't have to worry about the problem anymore. There are other examples that are really interesting. One from Cambodia. This involves, many systems around the world, as you know, allow constitutional courts to ban parties for specified reasons. This came out of like post-war Germany, right? Like, if the Nazi party were to come back, it would be banned by the constitutional court. And the court used this early on in several key cases, the German constitutional court, to ban anti-democratic parties. So like a neo-Nazi party was banned, and the Communist Party was banned in the 50s. Cambodia, 2013 election, the opposition shocks the incumbents and wins like 40% of the seats in the legislature. So the opposition, it had been an authoritarian state, but all of a sudden the opposition does well in elections. What does the ruling party do? It turns to the constitutional court, which it controls, and the constitutional court bans this party. So they're gone, right? They say they ban them on all these pretextual reasons. The next election, I think 2017, the ruling party wins every seat in the legislature. So you have a moment at which Cambodia might have actually democratized, and the court stops that from happening, right? A last example, which is so dramatic, is Venezuela, where the court acted as a rubber stamp under Chavez. Under Maduro, it does more than that, right? So under Maduro, 2015, end of 2015, the economic situation is so bad in Venezuela that Maduro's allies get crushed in the legislative elections. The opposition, despite the playing field being heavily tilted against them, the opposition dominates, wins control of like 70% of the seats in or 65% of the seats in the Venezuelan legislature. What then? Well, a lot of people thought, well, Venezuela is kind of democratized, right? The Supreme Court of Venezuela stopped that. How? They basically struck down every single amendment or every single law that the legislature proposed, right? Everything that the legislature passed, the Constitutional Court struck down. And eventually they disabled the legislature from acting altogether. They issue a famous decision. They hold the legislature in contempt because of 3 disputed electoral results in the Amazonian region of the country. So like the hinterlands of the country. But they say because of these three results, you seated people that shouldn't have been seated. You're in contempt. Because you're in contempt, you can't act as a legislature. Because you can't act as a legislature, there is a, quote, legislative omission, which is a doctrine we know about, right, from kind of neo-constitutionalism. Because there is a legislative omission, all of your powers are transferred to us or to an institution of our choosing, which meant the president. So they effectively transferred all of legislative power in the country to the president. That should strike you as utterly insane, right? I mean, that's unbelievable. But that's what they did. And so basically the court was the key institution for nullifying the opposition's electoral victories in 2015, right? It literally rendered them meaningless. So this one, you know, this problem of abusive judicial review, I think, is a real one. You know, courts are actually pretty effective tools at undermining democracy. The kind of boundaries of the concept are interesting to us, right? Like we focus on cases where the court is packed by the regime in a clear way. I do think it's interesting to think about cases like Brazil, to some degree Thailand was like this, where you can't see that packing as clearly, but you still might be worried about the anti-democratic effect of particular Supreme Court decisions, right? I think, in other words, I think that maybe some of the more interesting applications of the concept are cases where a court is carrying out these kind of decisions without having been clearly captured by the regime first. And I think those are, really interesting. I think that does happen. But we don't explore that much in this paper, right? I guess that would be like the next paper in a sense. And then the other thing I wanted to think about a little bit that is really hard is like, again, what is the solution to this? And that's really hard. I mean, we say some stuff about design of courts and also kind of treating courts a little bit more realistically, right? Like not automatically deferring to judicial decisions. Like when the Bolivian court issues a decision claiming that their own term limit provision is unconstitutional, the transnational community should be skeptical of that, right? They should not give that the normal deference that one gives to judicial decisions. But that said, it's tricky because you don't, I guess it's a kind of an English language expression, but you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? In other words, you don't want to get rid of the good because you're worried about the bad, right? And so, you know, we want to promote courts and judicial decision making and all that stuff at the international level and transnational level, but you'd want to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't enable anti-democratic or authoritarian projects. So I guess I'll stop there and see what people have to say. But that's kind of where I'm at with respect to the project.
Thank you, Professor. While you were speaking, I received a lot of questions and compliments. So now I'll just pass on the word to President João.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank my colleagues Alóquio and Rafael Coelho for inviting me to join such an important conference. Also, I would like to thank Professor Landau for the ability to be here with us, sharing his precious time and knowledge about such important topic that is abusive constitutionalism. One of the topics of our studies on Constitutional Studies Commission, which I currently have the honor of chairing. Professor Landau, thank you immensely for the excellent lecture given. It's an honor having you here today, and we hope to have you here in our state, Espírito Santo, as soon as possible. Now, we are ready for Professor Alokio's speech. Thank you very much. Please, Alokio.
Thank you. Professor Landau, let me speak a little bit in Portuguese that I forgot to mention one thing. Eu esqueci de dizer a todos e todas que nos assistem algo fundamental. A Florida State University tem um programa de LLM para alunos da América Latina e aqui no Brasil, isso é muito interessante, para advogados não americanos, para juristas não americanos conhecerem o sistema jurídico norte-americano. O professor Landau preside a Comissão de Assuntos Internacionais para o LLM da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade da Flórida. E todos, depois que tiverem interesse, nós deixaremos os contatos da Florida State University e do professor Landau, se for possível. So, I would like to thank also the opportunity of having you here, Professor Landau, and I would like to share some of my concerns. I don't have a research formally speaking in the subject. My concerns nowadays are focused on the judicial selection system and how it can influence in the judicial independence at the times when the jurisdiction is made, and we can see an abusive judicial review or not. So I would like to start making some points. The Brazilian Constitution was made not by a Constituent Assembly, as we should know. We had a Congress elected, and then this Congress elected was made to be the Assembly. We received all the negative points that the systems can bring. A lot of privileges, a lot of promises, and a lack of real democratic institutions. It's very easy in Brazil to see a very semantic way of to see the institutions. We say a lot. The institutions, the democratic institutions, are working for the good of who? For themselves or for the people? This is a very huge problem in Brazil. So when I first read the article of Professor Landau, it made me think a lot. The first one that I read was the Abusive Constitutionalism. And the second one, that is better than the first one, I think, is the Abusive Judicial Review. In both articles, Professor Landau shows a first point, his precision. Professor Landau writes just like a Swiss watch, with precision. Every point is very, very precise. And the next point is linked to the last one and will link us to another one. So it's in these articles, I started to wonder how the judicial review could be impacted by the judicial selections. In Brazil, we don't follow the American system. Only America and maybe India have elected judges nowadays. America and 2 other countries have elected judges. And I wondered about the judicial election because our doctrine says a lot. The judicial election can affect the judicial independence. Making my researches, I found just one article that refuses that argument. But this only one article is very precise. At the University of Chicago, 3 researchers, one of them, Professor Posner, the son of Richard Posner, they analyzed hundreds of decisions, and they found that the elected judges and the appointed judges, there is no qualitative difference among them. But in the other hand, elected judges bring democratic values to the judicial selection system. This is a concern when we talk about Brazil, because we have a judiciary that in the Constitution, that in our Constitution, had a lot of power. We don't have term limits for the Supreme Court, as they have in Germany, for example. We have a kind of a dream of being the American Supreme Court, but we don't have the self-restraint of the American Supreme Court judges. They have almost a life term, as in America, but we never had, for example, a process of impeachment of any judge in Brazil. Maybe 10 years ago, we had the last one, impeached Judge Thomas Porteous, a federal judge, and there are cases of attempt of impeaching even Supreme Court justices. The process don't go ahead, but they are attempted. When I started to pay attention for the perspective of abusive judiciary, I tried to focus how a judiciary in Brazil could be called like that. And I found my researchers in my research, I found a very complex decision of our Supreme Courts with the self-concessions of power. The Brazilian Supreme Court started 5 or 6 years ago, giving to themselves another 5 years of terms in the Supreme Court. We have a called amendment of the walking stick, the amendment of Bengala, that gave another 5 years for the time limit of retirement for our judges. When the Congress made that amendment, the debates in the Congress were very clear from the right side and from the left. Both of the political positions agreed in one thing: for a judge have another 5 years of term before the compulsory retirement age, they had to go through another hearing proceeding in the Congress. So what did the Supreme Court? Declared unconstitutional this new hearing procedure with the argument it undermines the judicial independence. It would be a double appointment system. But it's not a double appointment system, first of all. It's just a system of retention, not another appointment system. It's a retention procedure to retain the position. Saying that we can focus some decisions in our judiciary that is a self-concession of powers, a self-concession of power, a self-concession of privileges. Privilege not in the pejorative terms. Let's make it clear. In this environment, it causes a lot of concern when we see, like today, the Brazilian Supreme Court ruling in a very similar of policial state that the court itself can make prosecutions without a prosecutor. By themselves, they can prosecute someone. I don't know if here in Brazil we are prepared for what they had in Germany, the militant democracy. The court say what is possible or is not possible in terms of democracy. My concerns go back to the Germany, to the Germany, because if the winners of the World War II applied this militant democracy clause, there would not be much of the German at all. So it's a huge danger when we focus this kind of power in the hands of non-elected officials. I don't have a conclusion for my concerns yet, but I think that much more important than think in Brazil about your perspective of the abusive constitutionalism, or in your perspective, and the Professor Rosalind Dixon too, about the abusive judiciary review, when the would-be authoritarian captures the judicial system. In Brazil, we need to focus our concerns in a third situation, when the judicial power tries to capture the other incumbents of political offices. This is my main concern. And I don't know if in Brazil we're going to have a very easy answer. There are basic principles everywhere for an independent judiciary. But independent judiciary is a key for every democracy. We cannot have any form of democracy without an independent judiciary. But we need to comprehend that even for the judicial independence, we demand limits, comprehension, and these limits and this comprehension of the judicial independence must come, first of all, from the judiciary itself. In Brazil, we can't see a lot of self-restraint in our judiciary. In America, it is very common, the application of the self-restraint doctrine. Some days ago, we had in Brazil a problem, a huge problem of freedom of speech. And then came to debate the Justice Scalia's sentence in that case of the burning flag. He said, if I was the king, I would put in jail every one of these hippies, but I'm not the king. This is the quintessential of the self-restraint. A right-wing judge, a patriot judge that had very clear that he was not the king. He was not a ruler. He was a judge. This kind of thinking, this kind of judicial way of think the process, the jurisdiction itself, is not common among us. Brazil comes from a Roman, from the civil law, a Roman Germanic system. But from 15, 20 years, we have been invaded by the American influence, especially in the judicial system. We are not trained to practice law as the common law profession. And it comes to all those huge problems, another one. When you practice like a common law thinker, you are talking about values, ponderation, waging. We are waging values. And we can do that so easily when we need to see facts and rules as it demands in the civil law system. So I'm going to finish. I think that the recruitment system for the judiciary needs to change. If you are thinking about a judicial system with so high powers, we need to give or to impose to the judicial system higher standards of democratic representation, or term limits for the higher courts, or election or something like that, or an appointment system like in the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and other countries. Right? In Brazil, we have a kind of procedure to select judges. There is a kind of complex. The main procedure of recruiting a judge in Brazil is a civil servant test. We call it here concurso. The civil servant test selects the base of the judiciary. When we go up to the courts, 1/5 of the courts, every court in Brazil, we only separate the Supreme Court, that is different. 1/5 of these courts, they are recruited, a half of this fifth, from the prosecutors, and a half of this fifth from the lawyers. We call it the fifth of the Constitution, because it's in the Constitution. This is a kind of appointment. We could start from it or to improve it, but the retirement system in the higher courts should be reviewed. Brazilian system can't afford a judge in the Supreme Court during 25, 30, 35 years. It's too much power. It's much more power than a president in 3 terms. It's much more power in Brazil that you have in the United States with the life tenure. In the United States, you won't have 35 years of an associate justice in the Supreme Court. The average time is 20, 25, I don't know, over there. So it's a concern, but unfortunately, this concern is out of the radar. No? Our constitutional theory in Brazil is not concerned about it. There are 2 or 3 books about it. Professor Fernando Fontainha from the State University of Rio de Janeiro has a wonderful book called How to Be a Judge. Spectacular, but he focused on the French system. That is phenomenal. And I think that Frederico Almeida from São Paulo has another doctoral thesis about it. So I'd like to finish what I had to say, and I'd like to beg forgiveness to Professor Landau because my English is quite poor and I am not used to the cameras and things like that. Thank you very much, and I send the word to Rafael.
Thank you, Professor Alokyu. I won't take much of the time. I just want to make a brief comment on both of your explanations. First thing we learn, I remember one of the first classes I've been in FSU. One of the professors, I really don't remember who it was, said, law is accountability. They're both, the law and accountability are together, they come together. And the first class of constitutional law with Professor Landau was Marbury v. Madison, judicial review and self-restraint and all of that. So this leads me to a conclusion, and I want to leave these as a reflection to you, to all of us to think about it. Maybe the reason why we see the United States more restrained and this qualitative difference is of elected judicial judges and servant judges, they're not so far from each other, is because both of them are accountable for what you do at some point. Here in Brazil, we know that we lack accountability. We know that a judge, even when it's doing something that it did not supposed to do, it's a crime or something like that, our Constitution only gives retirement to this judge. The only other sanction of a way of remove this judge is through the impeachment process, and it's on our Constitution the possibility of the impeachment, but not the process of it. We know that we know that we could use, but as Professor Locke said, we never did. The only thing we do is retirement, and a judge goes to retirement with its pension. So I'm just leaving this as a reflection to all of you to think that maybe we should have more accountability towards our judicial brand, and from the other hand, judicial brand should have a little bit more of self-restraint when analyzing constitution problems or case problem, not to go overboard, not to go into other powers, privilege or prerogatives. I have here a couple of questions to both of you, Professor Landau and Professor Luck, if you're kind enough to answer. We're a little bit over our time, so just I'll try to make this as brief as possible. The first question is to Professor Landau. It's from the lawyer Adriano Coutinho, and what he wants to know is, usually leaders from the executive branch or the legislative branch, they use the Supreme Court and Constitution as a tool to do abusive things, to do things that are they're in violation to the Constitution itself. But could the Supreme Court, as an independent branch, have its own agenda? Could they use the lawsuits that they are in charge of to overreach this power, and they themselves provoke the abusive constitutionalism?
Thanks so much. So you want me to respond? I would respond to a couple of things that in both your remarks and Professor Alocchio's really interesting remarks as well, if that's okay. So I'll just take a couple minutes to, yeah, I think.
I'm sorry, Professor. We're just a little bit over time, so if you could make it concise, that would be perfect.
Yeah, I'll try to spend 2 minutes roughly, yeah.
Great.
So on judicial selection and this balance between accountability and independence, which I think is so important, I think that, so there is no substitute to some degree for internal checks on the judiciary, culture, as you were saying, self-restraint. I think those are in short supply in most legal systems most of the time, including in the US, where interestingly, the ideas of Justice Scalia about self-restraint are not so prominent on the court right now, for example. Many of them have kind of gone away in favor of a more kind of oppositional stance that, look, if we're right, we're right, and we're going to strike down the thing. And so I think the cultural checks are fundamental, but they're hard. The dynamic you talk about courts protecting their own powers is a big problem. Many countries, I think. You know, there are really interesting decisions both in India and Colombia. So I talked about this famous Uribe case in Colombia, but there's another recent case, 2 cases, where the court struck down constitutional amendments that reformed the system for disciplining judges. And the reforms were good reforms. I mean, you could debate them, but they were reasonable. The court said, no, you can't do this. It substitutes, it replaces judicial independence. You know, it's an attack on the court. So they struck it down. India, they tried to replace what they call the collegium system, where basically judges select their own replacements, more or less, which is a very unusual system, and obviously one that is ripe for abuse, with a normal system of political appointment. And the court struck that down as, you know, a violation of the basic structure of the Constitution. Both of these cases, I think, if the court had been willing to self-restrain by considering the problem in a more global perspective, they would have found that the changes were normal changes that other democracies around the world had carried out without big problems. So judicial aggrandizement is a problem, and it's a big one. The solution, I think that there's no perfect selection system, but some are better than others. I think that fragmenting appointment power protects against capture and protects against maybe judges having a single ideology. On the back end, anything that looks like life tenure to me is a disastrous mistake, including in the US. And that the better model is a model where the judge serves on the court for a more limited period of time. I don't know exactly what that time should be, but I'm pretty confident it should not be 30, 35 years, right? it should be longer than 5 years, I'm pretty sure. But once you start to get well up into the teens, you've got real problems, right? Judges consolidate too much power. So I do think that there is room for a debate that we could have fruitfully. And there, I think the comparison between the US and Brazil might actually be very useful, right? That I think in both countries, life tenure is a big problem, a huge problem. With respect to the other question about judges having their own agenda, and that's a terrific question. We're thinking about that. I think that that's right. You can have, I think it's very connected actually to Professor Olocio's comments as well, right? That judges themselves can become a kind of internal clique. And that's a type of problem that one sees in certain countries around the world. I don't know what the exact solution to that is. I think some of it is design. I think that, and I also think that sometimes those judges can have ideologies that actually are anti-democratic. Thailand's a very interesting example where the courts kept removing elected leaders on dubious grounds. And they weren't so much doing it on behalf of the government because the government was the elected leaders, but they were still removing them. And I would draw, it's a much murkier case, but I think that I have thought about this some without reaching any definitive conclusions. The role of the Brazilian judiciary in kind of the anti-corruption agenda, in a sense, which broadly speaking is very good, right? But that it creates a type of judiciary that believes it has a mandate to intervene aggressively in politics. And that intervention can be so aggressive that it actually has anti-democratic effects, in my view. And it's a tricky line to draw, right? What is the right? You want courts checking corruption, but at the same time, you want limits, self-restraint on the judiciary so that you're protecting a sphere of political activity. And I do think that it's possible, and one sees examples of courts surpassing that. So I guess another way to answer the question is, in this paper of use of judicial review, I'm worried about kind of one problem, which is regimes capturing a court and then turning the court into an anti-democratic instrument. But there are cases where courts through other means become a kind of anti-democratic instrument on their own. And that's also a very significant problem.
I have here two questions. I'll make them two because one is from an audience and the other one is mine. So Ana Amorim is asking if a constitutional amendment has positive consequences to a nation, but the background and intentions behind it is questionable from a democratic point of view, if this could be considered an abusive constitutionalism. And the other question of mine is regarding your abusive judicial review article. You state that it's necessary to assess the intention of the court or the leader that is packing the court to do something anti-democratic. How do you assess this? Because sometimes it's so thin line, so smooth that and it's so well put in an opinion or something like that that it's quite tricky to spot the real intention of that.
Great. Yeah, those are great questions. And they push on the two kind of elements of the definition that we're dealing with, right? Effects and intent, kind of nicely. Anti-democratic effect is tough. I mean, I think there are some cases where it's going to be pretty clear. You get rid of all the term limits in the country, for example, or you abolish the constitutional court, something like that. But most cases are subtle. And I think there are cases where you kind of don't know until well after the fact whether a decision actually has an anti-democratic effect or not. An interesting example from the US is gerrymandering, right? So gerrymandering is the practice of political actors drawing the boundary lines for electoral districts in ways that favor themselves. And this is very common in the US because states draw the lines. So state legislatures, depending on which party controls them, will just draw the lines to favor their own side. The Supreme Court issued a decision at the very end of last term where they said this is non-justiciable. We can't get involved in this. And there are good arguments that they should not. You know, it's a mess, basically. But the effect of that non-intervention is very complex, right? If both sides kind of gerrymander equally, then you might not worry that much. But if one side gains a big advantage, they can sort of insulate themselves from power, because we know that this gerrymandering technique, they're so good at it now. They use computer models and stuff that you can win an enormous amount of seats that way. So if the same party controls the state legislature in all of these key states, they would be able to manipulate the districts in ways that would basically rig the deck for the next decade, right? Where they kind of can't lose. So I guess that's a way of saying, like, effects is tough to assess, and I think there are cases where you're not going to know until years after the fact, right, what the actual effect of a decision is. But to us, it is about effect, right? It has to have an anti-democratic effect to count as abusive in a sense. So the kind of intention by itself is not enough, right? On the other hand, we are interested in the intent, as opposed to cases where, like, say a court issues a decision that has an anti-democratic effect and they do it by mistake. They misunderstand what the context is, or to us, that doesn't count as clearly, right, as a kind of intentional one. Intent is hard to judge. I think that's right. But the kind of examples we're looking at in the paper are pretty clear, right? Because you look for, to us, you look for a few things. One is kind of procedural irregularities. So like a dramatic example, this Nicaraguan case we talked about before, they sent the notice of the session only to the pro-Ortega justices. So the rest of the justices didn't even know when the court was sitting, right? So they couldn't show up. And the court met at like midnight, basically. Then you look at reasoning, like what is the reasoning within a range of kind of reasonable interpretations of a norm? And I think that's useful. That said, like there are examples that are clearly going to be kind of tricky, I think. And we wrestled a lot in the piece about whether we should only focus on impact, effect, or we should look at intent as well. We settled eventually on looking at intent because I think we're trying to get at the way you would respond to a court is different depending on whether or not the court is intending to do what it does, right? Like a court that has good faith is acting in good faith, but is doing some things that are anti-democratic. You wouldn't want to sanction that court, right? Whereas part of our argument is like, you really do want to kind of go after both domestically and internationally courts that are intentionally trying to undermine electoral democracy. I do think that happens. But I think it's a great question. I think it does point out the kind of the slipperiness of the intent part of the definition.
I want to address you a question. What happens when an unconstitutional rule is made by the Supreme Court? What are the remedies that we have for abusive constitutionalism? I mean, what are the limits, and who's responsible to overturn this? Just make it make an argument.
I think it's very tricky. I think, look, if the abusive actor is the political branches like the president, then the remedy mainly you think about as being the court, right? But oftentimes, as I talked about, courts are not effective in that context. And in fact, if you think about term limits in Latin America, I would argue it's more the public through like demonstrations that's had an impact on stopping presidents from overstaying than it is the court. The Colombian case, again, is exceptional. But you do have a lot of cases, Paraguay, Ecuador, for example, where people took to the streets and kind of forced out a president Bolivia was a little bit like that as well, right? So I don't know how effective courts are as a defense, to be honest. Now, if the court is the one doing the anti-democratic thing, it gets even harder because courts are kind of designed not to be that accountable to the public, right? So the remedy to that, I think, is quite difficult. I mean, you can think about things like impeachment, but we know those are extraordinary, right? You know, in the U.S. as well, basically, you haven't impeached Supreme Court justices. There was an attempt early on in the U.S. history, but it failed. And lower court justices are mainly impeached when they get convicted of crimes, right? So it's not used as a mechanism of kind of disciplining the judiciary. I really don't know. I mean, I think one irony of the paper, in a way, is the same tools that regimes use to take control of courts are tools you might use to like depack a court if a court is acting anti-democratically, right? So like there's debates about court packing in the US all the time. The US Constitution famously does not set the size of the court. So ordinary law can change the size of the US Supreme Court. That could be used very effectively by anti-democratic actors to pack it, right? You increase the size and you put a bunch of judges on it who favor your program. But of course, it could also be used to like depack if the court is already packed, right? So like this is an argument against trying to solve too much of this stuff by design and keeping things flexible, is that the error you make with design often is that you think there's only one problem you need to guard against. And there's actually a bunch of different problems, right? And the same things that can be a solution to one problem might cause you more problems with another, which I guess is a complex way of saying many, many things just can't be solved with design, I think, right? Or not effectively.
Great. Professor Alocchio, could you make an argument in a Brazilian point of view, please?
Before talking a little bit about Brazil, I would like to explain to many people that are watching us that don't work in the electoral law. Professor Landau spoke about gerrymandering. Over there in the United States, they work in a district form of election. We are trying to import the system of district votes. The votes in districts can be manipulated, and in the United States, they have a new verb in English, gerrymander or gerrymandering, because Elbridge Gerry, that was one politician who used this tool, changing the position of the format of those districts to influence in the results of the elections. To put it in a I asked for the techniques to put the image of a gerrymandering system. I sent to them. I don't know if they are going to put. So what the Supreme Court said, we can't change the legislative opinion or a law or an executive order or executive decision to format the districts. The judicial review was not imposed on the legislative or on the executive decisions. When we bring that to Brazil, I don't have doubts that we are going to have the judicial review in every case of tentative of gerrymandering or changing the districts. Not because it's positive for democracy, just because the judiciary can say the last word. It's maybe a bigger problem. So I don't know. Let me see. He's trying to put the image over there to show to our assistants where when it's ready. But going on, the Brazilian problem today, and I'm going to conclude my participation with this. The Brazilian system today, exactly today, nowadays, is facing a huge dilemma. Our courts, especially the Supreme Court, is advancing through legislative power, through executive powers, and through some liberties. It's a huge concern. It's much more problem when you advance on private liberties, when you advance on other branches of the government. We change the meaning of freedom of speech, and we convert freedom of speech in crime. So we can impose restrictions, we can impose charges and things like that. In Brazil, the studies of Professor Landau certainly will show us the way to improve our democratic system. And I would like to finish my participation, and now it's for sure, that some months ago, me and Dr. João were making a defense of the state bar in a case against unconstitutional amendment in our state, and we quoted Professor Landau theory of abusive constitutionalism, and until today, we had a judicial provision against the constitutional abusive amendment that they are trying to make here in our states. Thank you, Professor Landau. It's an honor, again, being here with you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. I would like to thank everyone that took time to hear us, to listen to us, and stayed to the very end. We know that we're over our time, but you stayed, and for that we appreciate. Especially, we know that it's hard to listen to this in a different language that is not ours. For that, thank you. Thank you, Professor Alokio. Thank you, President João, and especially Professor Landau for taking the time to share with us some of her inputs.
Thanks so much. It was an honor.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night and a great weekend.